1970s, the Brotherhood established an underground paramilitary organization.
Here. Our speaker tonight is Stephen Gowans, who's the author of Washington's Long War Against Syria, published by Baraka Books. You can get a signed copy of the book after the meeting, $25. So, Stephen, thanks for coming to Vancouver.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin in an unorthodox manner. I'm going to begin not by reference to my own book, but by reference to the work of another author. And his name is Graham E. Fuller. And I'm going to do so to set the stage. Now, who is Graham E. Fuller? Graham E. Fuller had a 27-year career in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. At various times, he was the CIA station chief in Kabul. Fuller says that a majority of leaders in the Arab world are supported and empowered by the West and pursue pro-Western policies unpopular with local populations. That means that a minority of leaders in the Arab world are not supported, empowered by the West. A minority of leaders who we may infer from Fuller's analysis who are not supported in the West because they do not support pro-Western policy. So which leaders make up this minority? Well, one way to figure that out is to consider where the U.S. military footprint is absent. So in the Arab and Muslim worlds, there are or have recently been U.S. military installations in Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Djibouti, and the Philippines. So what Arab and Muslim countries are conspicuously absent from this? Well, I'd say there are a few. The Islamic Republic of Iran is absent from the list. Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam, is absent from the list. Gaddafi's Libya is absent. And Assad's Syria. There are no U.S. military bases in Iran. And indeed, the country's constitution forbids the establishment of foreign military installations on Iranian soil. There are no U.S. military installations in Syria, except for the ones that are there legally, established by U.S. forces in contravention of international law. Condoleezza Rice, the former U.S. Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, told National Public Radio in the United States in connection with the release of her memoirs that U.S. foreign policy is guided not by goals of democracy and human rights promotion, but, quote, for every president, for every Secretary of State, American national security and American economic interests, of course, that is the primary goal. Or, as Robert Gates, who is the former director of the CIA and U.S. Defense Secretary, put it, the United States has an interest in unimpeded economic activity. So my argument in the book is that the markets, the labor, the resources of Iraq under Saddam were not fully open in an unimpeded manner to the United States. That the labor, markets and resources of Libya under Gaddafi were not fully open to the United States in an unimpeded manner. That the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran today and Syria today are impediments to U.S. investment and trade. And the hostility of Washington to Saddam's Iraq, to Gaddafi's Libya, to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and to what I'm going to call Arab nationalist Syria, is ultimately traceable to the U.S. project of attempting to exploit the Arab and Muslim worlds economically, and the resistance of some of those states to that project. And let me begin by saying that while this book is entitled Washington's Long War in Syria, that the war is more multiform than the title suggests. It's not only a war between Washington and its allies on one hand, and the government of Damascus and its allies on the other, it's also a civil war that has been going on since the late 1940s between Islamists on the one hand and secularists on the other. In the 1960s, the Muslim Brothers led protests, strikes, demonstrations, riots, all kinds of disruptions in Syria.
In the 1970s, the Brotherhood established an underground paramilitary organization, anticipating the so-called rebels, Syrian rebels of today. The 1970s rebels were trained and armed outside of Syria, just as today's rebels are trained and armed outside of Syria in bases in Qatar and Jordan, with US and Saudi and Qatari and Jordanian and Turkish money, and also, as was revealed last week in the Wall Street Journal, with Israeli money. The brothers launched a major campaign of urban guerrilla warfare. They assassinated Ba'ath Arab socialists, they murdered state officials, they killed army officers, they attacked Syrian government offices, and they assaulted Syrian military installations.
In the 1980s, the Brotherhood established an Islamic Front for Syria, whose manifesto declared a war without end until Ba'ath Arab socialism, that is secularism, was exterminated in Syria. So the Ba'ath Arab socialists now have the same goal as the Muslim Brothers. They're both anti-imperialist organizations. They both seek to achieve the liberation of the Arab or the Muslim world. In 1982, the Muslim Brothers seized control of Hama, which is Syria's fourth largest city. They went on a blood-soaked rampage through the city, attacking police stations. They murdered every Ba'ath Arab socialist they could lay their hands on. They executed government officials. They killed soldiers. In fact, every Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party official in the city was executed, many by beheading. In the Syrian government operation to quell the uprising, the Syrian Arab Army captured more than 15,000 foreign-supplied firearms, along with prisoners including Jordanian and CIA-trained paramilitary forces. Likewise, insurgents operating in Syria today have been trained by the CIA and other Western intelligence services in Jordan and Qatar. In the 1990s, the Muslim Brotherhood established an alliance with other sectarian Sunni political Islamists to form what became known as the National Front for the Salvation of Syria, but which was perhaps more aptly called the National Front for the Salvation of Syria, from Arab nationalism, from secularism, from socialism. So let's jump to 2001. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark told a reporter that during a trip to the Pentagon, he had learned that plans had been drawn up to invade a number of countries.
I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
In 2002, Syria was added to the Bush administration's Axis of Evil, its regime change hit list. You may recall that the original Axis of Evil included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. In 2002, 3 other countries were added: Sudan, Cuba, Syria. Why? Syria was added because the U.S. claimed that Syria was developing weapons of mass destruction and supporting terrorism. The same charges it leveled against Iraq. Iraq, by the way, was also governed by a Ba'ath Arab socialist. Saddam belonged to the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party. Saddam embraced Ba'ath Arab socialist goals. If you look at the constitution that Saddam had drawn up for Iraq, you'll see explicit references to unity, freedom, socialism. He defined an economic program for Iraq as a socialist program based on public ownership of the economy and planning of the economy. The first alternative to an invasion was to impose broad-ranging sanctions on Syria to do what sanctions are always intended to do. The sanctions on Syria, as intended, devastated the economy. This isn't widely recognized, but in October 2011, the New York Times reported that the Syrian economy, quote, was buckling under the pressure of sanctions by the West. The veteran foreign correspondent Patrick Coburn likened the sanctions imposed on Syria to the sanctions that had been imposed by the United States on Iraq from the early 1990s to 2003. Those sanctions, according to a UN estimate, led to the deaths of at least 500,000 Iraqi children through disease and malnutrition. That is, produced more deaths than had been produced by all the weapons of mass destruction in history. This led two political scientists, John and Carl Mueller, to dub the sanctions sanctions of mass destruction, more devastating than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, more devastating than all the mustard gas used in World War I. Now, largely unrecognized is that sanctions of this caliber have been destroying Syria for the past 14 years. So we see the attacks carried out by Washington's proxy guerrilla armies. You see the beheadings, you see the eviscerations, you see the suicide bombings. But what we don't see are the invisible but equally devastating, indeed more devastating, effects of sanctions. Now, significantly, the moment sanctions were lifted on a defeated Ba'ath Arab socialist Iraq in 2003, they were immediately imposed on an unbowed Ba'ath Arab socialist Syria, where they've remained to this very day. Which means that from 1990 to 2017, for the past quarter century, the United States and its allies, including Canada, have waged a highly destructive campaign of economic warfare, the equivalent, in terms of victims, of a nuclear attack. First on Iraq, subsequently on Syria, and they've done so, why? They've done so because they're opposed to the Ba'ath Arab socialists' efforts to bring the politics and the economies of the Arab world under the control of the people who live and work in the Arab world. So sanctions contributed or constituted the first means by which regime change was to be brought about in the absence of an invasion. The second was to reignite the Islamist war on the Syrian state. The Islamist war had largely been quelled by 1982 after the uprising in Hama. But the US government always recognized that the principal opposition force in Syria was the Islamists, the Muslim Brothers. In 2006, therefore, just a few years after the United States decided that it was going to have to achieve regime change by means other than an invasion, Syria's Muslim Brotherhood had at least 2 meetings at the White House, according to the Wall Street Journal. In 2007, the Muslim Brotherhood helped found the National Salvation Front. The front met frequently, again, according to the Wall Street Journal, with the U.S. State Department and the U.S. National Security Council, as well as with the U.S. government-funded Middle East Partnership Initiative. In late 2010, December 2010, just a few months before riots were to erupt in the Syrian city of Dara, marking what would become known as the Arab Spring in Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood announced that it was its hope that a civil revolt would arise soon to topple the so-called heretical government of Bashar al-Assad. Well, that hope was realized just a few months later. But it was an outcome that the United States and the Muslim Brotherhood had been working on since 2006. But you know, in early 2011, January, February, before the uprising in Dara, as upheaval swept across the Arab world, all was quiet in Syria. And this perplexed Western news organizations. You know, there were demonstrations at the time in Tunisia, there was tumult in Egypt, there was an uprising in Libya, but not the slightest evidence of political distemper in Syria. And the editors at the New York Times and Time magazine scratched their heads and wondered why that was. And they dispatched reporters to find out. And here's what the reporters found. They said all was quiet in Syria because the government had broad support. They said all was quiet in Syria because even critics conceded that Assad was popular. They said all was quiet in Syria because Assad had, this is Time magazine, endeared himself to the population, especially youth, the segment from which a rebellion was supposed to spring if indeed a rebellion materialized. They said all is quiet in Syria because attempts to organize protests had, Time magazine said, fizzled. They said it appeared that Syrians felt no compulsion to protest against their government. And you can confirm all of this by searching the internet archives of the New York Times and the Time magazine for articles on Syria written in February, March, and April of 2011. Well, in mid-March 2011, a riot broke out in Dara. It was a violent riot, as riots are violent. Some rioters carried guns, buildings were burned, vehicles were set fire to. Even U.S. officials, according to the New York Times, quote, acknowledged that the demonstrations were not peaceful and that some protesters were armed. Now, in the mythology that would later develop about the origins of the post-2010 conflict, this became the protests were largely peaceful, which is a really interesting way of constructing a sentence. Largely peaceful means they weren't peaceful, they were violent. But the sentence is constructed in a way to suggest they were peaceful. The modifier largely was dropped altogether, so the story became the demonstrations were peaceful. You can read that in a number of newspaper articles these days. But at the time, neither the New York Times nor U.S. officials saw the protests as peaceful and acknowledged that they were violent. A week after the outbreak of violence in Dara, Time reported that, quote, there do not appear to be widespread calls for the fall of the regime or the removal of the popular president. Well, that clashes with the narrative, the mythology that subsequently developed. Over a month after the riot in Dara, the New York Times, Anthony Shadid, would report that, quote, the protests fall short of popular upheaval of revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. Now, significantly, very significantly, Time would report that Islam was playing a prominent role in the protest. So, look back at the history of Syria. We have civil disturbances fomented by Islamists dating to the 1960s. We have Islamist guerrilla warfare starting in 1970, culminating in the violent takeover of an entire city in 1982. We have Islamists meeting with the White House, with the State Department, with the National Security Council from 2006 after the United States discovers that it has to abandon its plans for direct intervention, military intervention in Syria because its hands are full with Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have Islam playing a prominent role in the protests, which are violent and involve arms. Consistent with this, in 2012, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, one of a number of intelligence agencies which make up the vast U.S. intelligence community, revealed that the insurgency was Islamist and led by, who did they say? The Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the forerunner of Islamic State. So you have indication after indication that the uprising was not a peaceful secular movement for liberal democracy, but a renewal of Syria's decades-long civil war between Islamists and secularists, egged on, facilitated, promoted, financed by the United States and its allies, who needed a proxy to carry out a war because it could not intervene directly owing to its entanglements in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2012, in response to the uprising, the current president, Bashar al-Assad, oversaw an amendment to the Constitution which said that the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party is no longer first among equals, that we'll now have multi-candidate presidential elections. One of the demands that the demonstrators had made in 2011 was to repeal the security law. The security law is equivalent to our War Measures Act. And the security law had been invoked for a number of reasons, not least of which is that Syria is officially at war with Israel. Israel annexed Syrian territory of the Golan Heights, is colonizing it. Syria faces a very precarious security situation. There's the war with Israel. Certain conservative Arab states are hostile to Syria. The United States is hostile to Syria. That's clear to the Syrian government. Any state facing that kind of precarious security environment would invoke a security law. Canada certainly would, if faced by threats, even marginally significant compared to what Syria faces. But in the face of demands to repeal the security law, the government repealed it. So essentially, what it did was that the current government has created in Syria a political structure that is very much like the paradigm of multi-party representative democracy favored in the West. And it's more like that than virtually every Arab country, and especially the military and royal dictatorships, which are the principal allies of the United States, the Saudi Arabias and Bahrains and Qatars and United Arab Emirates. Despite the fact that the Syrian government made these concessions in the direction of liberal democracy, the concessions were completely rejected by the insurgents and rejected by their supporters in the West. They're rejected by the insurgents because the insurgents aren't interested in a liberal secular democracy. They're interested in an Islamic state based on the Quran. They're not interested in democracy. Democracy comes not from the Quran, it comes from the minds of man. And despite these concessions, the insurgency heated up. Certainly not fighting for democracy, given that their sponsorship also very significantly includes the United States, which promotes not democracy, but as Condoleezza Rice acknowledged, U.S. business interests. At the same time, the foreign correspondent Patrick Coburn wrote not too long ago that Washington has always wanted to get rid of Assad, long before 2011, just as Washington always wanted to get rid of his father, who was viewed as an Arab communist. History didn't start in 2011 where Syria is concerned, although many people seem to think it did. So, the United States and sectarian Sunni political Islam formed an alliance of convenience to eliminate a common enemy from the Syrian state. Now, the standard operating procedure of U.S. campaigns of regime change is to reduce a government Washington abhors to a single individual who then can be demonized as a Hitler or branded a brutal dictator or an animal, as Trump called Assad, or a moral disgrace, as Noam Chomsky called Assad, and so on. But the enemy is not the individual. If Assad were to step down today and leave in his place a successor who also espoused Ba'ath Arab socialist values, the war would continue. Because the war isn't about Assad per se, it's about the project he leads. They said that they should carry out a regime change in Syria because Assad is against Israel, is against the West, and so on. That is despotism. And those who struggle against such despots, that is the United States, the American despots, are the real defenders of democracy. Assad has said, Syria is an independent state working for the interests of its people, rather than making the Syrian people work for the interests of the West. So, because Gaddafi had a different view, because Assad had a different view, they're targeted for elimination. So, a day after this book was sent to press, I read a short essay by, and I see someone has his t-shirt here, Norman Bethune. And let me read you the epigraph. Are wars of aggression, wars for the conquest of colonies, just big business? Yes, it would seem so, however much the perpetrators of such national crimes seek to hide their true purpose behind banners of high-sounding abstractions and ideals. The most insightful part of Bethune's essay, in my view, is the last paragraph. So in the last paragraph, he writes, what do these enemies of the human race look like? And he's referring to those who, in the hunt for profit, start the wars which create the wounds which he was called upon to heal. Do they wear on their foreheads a sign so that they may be told, shunned, and condemned as criminals? No. On the contrary, they're the respectable ones. They are honored. They call themselves gentlemen and are called gentlemen. They're the pillars of the state, of the church, of society. They support private and public charity out of the excess of their wealth. They endow institutions in their private lives. They are kind and considerate and charming. But there's one sign by which these gentlemen can be told. Threaten a reduction in their profits, and the beast in them awakens with a snarl. They become ruthless as savages, brutal as madmen, remorseless as executioners. And when you read in the Wall Street Journal that Western oil companies had complained to the US State Department that something had to be done about Gaddafi, who had threatened a reduction in his profits, in their profits, you know, it's hard not to think about the pillars of society and respectable people of whom Bethune wrote. So Bethune ended his essay with this: such an organization of human society as permits these enemies of humanity to exist must be abolished. And the overarching theme of this book is that Washington's long war on Syria can only be understood in the context of an organization of human society that permits these enemies of humanity to exist. Thank you. Thank you.